One Tuesday morning, I looked up from my desk and saw three strangers in bright yellow vests standing behind my house, on my grass, aiming cameras through my garage windows like they were casing the place. Except they weren't burglars, they were the HOA. When I told them they were trespassing, one of them actually smirked and said the tree line meant they could go wherever they wanted. That was the exact moment I knew this wasn't about hedges or sheds or community standards. This was about power, and they thought nobody in the neighborhood knew enough to call their bluff. My wife and I moved out to this subdivision about 8 years ago, 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place people buy when they want a little breathing room without giving up modern life. We've got just over 3 acres, most of it backing into what the neighborhood calls common area, though in reality it's just a stretch of woods and brush that makes people feel like they live farther out than they do. One of the reasons we bought here was because the HOA had always been mostly harmless. They collected dues, held the occasional yard sale, sent mildly annoying emails, that sort of thing. Nothing dramatic. Then a new board president got elected. You know the type, talks like every sentence came out of a leadership seminar, uses phrases like protecting investment value and community synergy with a straight face, and somehow manages to sound both fake polite and condescending at the same time. Within a month, she had half the neighborhood convinced we were one faded mailbox away from societal collapse. Suddenly we needed comprehensive oversight, uniform compliance, a refreshed neighborhood vision. I remember sitting in that board meeting thinking, this woman doesn't want to maintain the neighborhood. She wants to run it. Now, I work as a land surveyor, which ended up matching a whole lot more than she probably expected. My job is basically precision, boundaries, legal lines, inches that turn into lawsuits when people ignore them. So when she announced the HOA had hired an outside compliance team to do a full sweep of the neighborhood, I got a bad feeling. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was professional paranoia, but I decided I wasn't going to wait until somebody with a clipboard started inventing problems in my backyard. So I had my property resurveyed. A colleague I trust came out, we walked the whole perimeter, and he reset every pin clean and visible. Bright pink flagging tape, fresh markers, no ambiguity. According to the survey, my property line actually ran farther back into the tree line than most people assumed. That mattered, because from the street it looked like the woods were the natural border, but the legal boundary said otherwise. I also upgraded my camera system around the same time, full perimeter coverage, high-resolution audio, night vision, the whole deal. My wife laughed and said I was spiraling a little. Maybe I was. But I've learned that when people start talking about zero tolerance, you'd better have receipts. Then came that Tuesday. I was working from home, sitting in my office with a mug of coffee beside me, when I caught movement out back. At first I thought utility workers had taken a wrong turn, but then I saw the clipboards, the measuring wheel, the expensive cameras. I pulled up the live feed from my security system, and there they were, 3 of them, walking across my backyard like it was a public park. One woman was directing the whole thing with that brisk, overconfident energy some people mistake for competence. One of the men was taking photos of my shed. The other one was measuring my hedges. Then he walked up to my detached garage and started peering through the windows. That flipped a switch in me. I didn't rush outside right away. I stayed calm. I screen recorded the live feed, saved the camera angles, made sure everything was being captured from multiple points. If these people were going to make a mistake, I wanted the whole thing documented. I watched them spend 10 solid minutes inspecting my property, measuring my hedges, checking the shed color, tying orange tape to branches like they were tagging evidence at a crime scene. That was the part that really got me. It wasn't just nosy. It was arrogant. They weren't acting like visitors. They were acting like owners. So I walked out there with my coffee like I had all the time in the world. The woman glanced at me, annoyed more than embarrassed, and said they were with the Architectural Review Committee. Then she told me I was being cited for an unapproved structure and non-compliant landscaping, and suggested I stay back so they could finish the assessment. Suggested. I asked for identification and the specific bylaw section authorizing them to enter private property without notice. One of the guys, measuring wheel, smug little half-smile, waved his hand and said it was all in my contract, that they had authority to be wherever they needed in order to conduct their review. So I pulled the HOA bylaws up on my phone. I read the exact clause out loud. The HOA had right of entry for easements and common areas, but access to private improved acreage required 48 hours written notice unless there was an emergency. No notice had been given. No emergency existed. End of story. That's when the woman pointed toward the woods and said they weren't on private property anyway. They were still in the common area near the treeline. I almost laughed. I told them they were currently standing well inside my legal boundary, and that the bright pink survey flags they'd walked past weren't decorative. They marked iron pins, filed with the county, establishing the official line. The guy with the measuring wheel said, and I swear I'm not improving this for dramatic effect, natural boundaries supersede survey markers. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with people who were merely mistaken. I was dealing with people who were either dangerously ignorant or completely comfortable bluffing their way through someone else's property rights. I changed gears. Instead of arguing, I called the HOA management office on speakerphone right there in front of them. The secretary cheerfully confirmed that yes, they had sent out a zero-tolerance compliance team that morning, and yes, they were doing a full sweep of the neighborhood. Perfect. I thanked her, hung up, reached into my pocket, and handed the team leader a pre-filled notice of trespass. I told them they had 60 seconds to remove themselves from my property, or I'd call the police. I also informed them that every second of this was being recorded on multiple cameras, including the part where they photographed through my garage windows. Their confidence cracked fast. The woman started muttering about just doing our job. The guy with the wheel called me unreasonable, but they started packing up. I watched them pull the orange tape off my hedges and shuffle back toward the woods, suddenly a lot less interested in compliance. The second they cleared my property, I exported the footage, backed up the files, and called the non-emergency police line. A patrol officer came out, and to his credit, he actually listened. I showed him the survey markers, the footage, the phone recording, all of it. He was especially interested in the photos through the garage windows. He said depending on what they captured, that crossed into invasion of privacy territory. He took a report and said he'd follow up. And that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A couple hours later, I got a call from the owner of the consulting firm the HOA had hired. Suddenly there had been a misunderstanding. Suddenly they wanted to come back and apologize. Suddenly they were willing to delete the photos. That told me everything. If they'd thought they were in the right, they would have doubled down. Instead they panicked. I told him all future communication would go through my attorney. Over the next few days, things got even more interesting. I looked into the consulting firm and found out their entire business model was basically legalized harassment dressed up in business casual language. They specialized in helping HOAs optimize revenue through aggressive enforcement. In plain English, they found violations, pushed fines, and took a cut. Then my attorney dug into the board minutes from the meeting where they approved the contract, and that's where the twist hit. The president had recommended starting with properties resistant to prior board initiatives. That wasn't random wording. I'd voted against her. I'd spoken up in meetings before. I'd questioned a few of her pet projects. And now, somehow, the very first property their team decided to assess was mine. So this wasn't just overreach. It was targeted. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, word had spread all over the neighborhood. The room was packed. Folding chairs full, people standing along the walls, that low restless buzz you hear before a storm breaks. And it turned out I wasn't the only one. An older neighbor said the team had come through his unlocked gate and photographed his pool. A woman down the street said they'd been measuring around her house while she was asleep after a night shift. Another homeowner had video of them stepping over landscaping rocks to get a better angle into his yard. So when my turn came, I didn't rant. I didn't yell. I just connected my laptop to the projector and let the footage speak. The room went dead quiet. They watched the team walk across my lawn. They watched them photograph through the garage windows. They watched me read the bylaw aloud. They watched the smugness evaporate the second I handed over that trespass notice. Then my attorney stood up and explained what the board had exposed themselves to: invasion of privacy, harassment, intentional trespass, possible class action exposure, and maybe most importantly, personal liability. The HOA insurance policy didn't cover intentional misconduct by board members or agents. That landed like a brick through a window. The president tried to defend herself, said the consulting firm had assured them everything was legal, said enforcement was necessary to protect property values, all the usual nonsense. But then one of the other board members admitted he hadn't realized the team would be entering private property. The treasurer looked pale when she learned the firm was being paid thousands plus a percentage of collected fines. And then the secretary read part of the contract out loud: aggressive enforcement, revenue strategy, maximize collections. That was it. The board voted that night to terminate the contract, void every violation notice the firm had issued, and review the HOA's enforcement process from scratch. A few days later, the HOA's attorney sent over a settlement, reimbursement for my legal costs, formal apology, no action on my hedges, written notice requirements for future entry, and a real appeal process for homeowners. I signed it because honestly, by then it wasn't about squeezing blood out of a stone. It was about stopping the machine before it rolled over someone who couldn't afford to fight back. Then came the special election. The president got blown out. Not barely, not gracefully, blown out. More than 3-1. The new board president was a retired engineer whose basic philosophy was, and I'm paraphrasing here, leave people alone unless they're creating an actual problem. The bylaws got cleaned up, enforcement got scaled back, and somehow the neighborhood didn't collapse into chaos after all. Amazing how that works. And yes, I did one more thing. With part of the settlement money, I built a beautiful 6-foot cedar privacy fence right along the rear survey line. Perfectly legal, perfectly permitted, perfectly HOA compliant. It also happened to block the former president's favorite sunset view from her back porch. Petty? Maybe a little. But it was legal, clean, and deeply satisfying. She moved away about a year later. The consulting firm folded not long after that. The neighborhood got quieter. My hedges are still tall. My cameras are even better now. And every once in a while, when I'm standing out back near that fence and the evening light hits the trees just right, I think about how close this whole thing came to going another way. Because the truth is, most bullies don't count on resistance, they count on exhaustion. They count on people being busy, intimidated, confused, or too polite to push back. And maybe that's the part that stuck with me the most. Authority isn't the same thing as being right. A clipboard doesn't make trespassing legal. A title doesn't make arrogance wisdom. And rules stop meaning anything the second they're only enforced against people who are inconvenient. In the end, they came to my house hoping to measure my hedges. What they really measured was how badly things can go when the wrong people mistake power for permission. So now I want to ask you this. When somebody hides behind rules to control other people, is beating them fair play? Or does that make you just as ruthless as they are? Tell me what you think in the comments. Who was right? Who crossed the line? And have you ever had to stand your ground against someone who thought authority meant ownership?